Walter Grady had become part of the scenery in a Brooklyn neighborhood that changed faster than most could keep up with. At 66, he moved through the streets like a shadow, unobtrusive, constant, fading into the backdrop of gentrified storefronts and rusted scaffolding. He carried everything he owned in a worn military-issue backpack, its olive canvas long since bleached by sun and hardship, straps repaired and re-repaired with shoelaces, safety pins, and patience. The locals called him the Quiet One. Unlike others in his condition, Walter never begged, never shouted, never drew attention to himself. He collected bottles, sorted aluminum cans, nodded respectfully to store owners he passed each day. He rotated the doorways where he spent his nights, careful not to linger, careful not to inconvenience. The ritual was part courtesy, part survival. On especially cold days, a few workers at Morelli's corner market would slip him a bruised apple or a stale roll without words. He accepted them like medals, stored them like treasure. In return, he never caused trouble. Never asked for more. Just a tired man with silver in his beard and smoke in his eyes. What few knew, what almost no one had reason to ask, was that Walter had worn the uniform of the U.S. Army for 20 years. He had held rank, led men, earned medals that now sat buried somewhere beneath the shirts and socks in his pack. His last tour ended in 2004. He returned to a modest apartment in Crown Heights, where his wife Margaret waited with soup on the stove and jazz on the radio. Then cancer came. Quiet at first, then thunderous. The VA clinic misread her scans, called it stress, then acid reflux. By the time the truth came, there was nothing left to do but hold her hand. She died 2 months after diagnosis. Walter unraveled quietly. The medals meant nothing. The pension felt poisoned. He gave everything away, the furniture, the apartment, even the savings they tucked aside. The last check he cashed was turned into a donation for Margaret's favorite animal shelter. Then he disappeared. Sometimes, he once murmured to a volunteer at a soup kitchen, "It's easier to be nobody than to be somebody who failed the person they loved most." On a bitter November afternoon, with the sky the color of wet slate and frost crackling on the pavement, Walter walked into Morelli's corner market for shelter. His stomach had been empty for 3 days, and his fingers were beginning to tremble. The doorbell jingled softly as he entered. The store was quiet, just Mr. Morelli at the register and a young woman browsing cereal. Walter glanced at the racks. Day-old bread sat in a basket near the counter. His throat burned. His pride warred with his hunger. But something inside him yielded. As Mr. Morelli turned to help the other customer, Walter slipped the loaf beneath his coat and moved toward the door. "Hey! Stop right there!" The shout rang out like a crack of thunder. Mr. Morelli pointed up at the mirror installed only 2 weeks earlier. A new deterrent. One that worked. "I'm calling the cops," he snapped, reaching for the phone. Walter didn't run. He didn't argue. He simply turned around and placed the loaf back on the counter. "I just needed strength to live one more day," he said quietly. 2 police officers arrived minutes later. The younger of the two, Officer Jenkins, seemed uncertain as he placed cuffs on Walter's frail wrists. "You really a vet?" Jenkins asked, noticing the faded dog tags beneath Walter's coat. "This ID looks pretty worn." Walter nodded once. "I used to be someone useful." "Not anymore." Jenkins looked to his partner, then to Mr. Morelli. "Store owner's pressing charges. Says he's been caught stealing before." Walter was taken in and booked like any petty thief. Fingerprints. A rushed meeting with an overworked public defender who barely looked up from the case file. He spent the night in holding, curled on a steel bench that groaned beneath his weight. He didn't sleep. Just waited. The next morning, still wearing the same threadbare coat, he was escorted into courtroom 4B in Brooklyn Municipal Court. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The clerk called the case in a bored voice. Case number 47,293. State versus Walter Grady. The prosecutor, young and efficient, stood with a folder in hand. "Your Honor, the defendant was apprehended stealing bread from a local market. Given his prior incidents and lack of a fixed address, we recommend continued detention until trial. Walter didn't flinch. Didn't blink. Walter Edward Grady. Former Staff Sergeant. United States Army. Judge Michael Carmichael's voice trailed off as he read the file. Something changed in the judge's expression. His fingers tightened around the edge of the bench, his knuckles whitening. He looked at Walter. Then back at the file. Then again at Walter. Without a word, Judge Carmichael rose. The courtroom stilled. Judges don't stand during arraignments. We will take a 15-minute recess, he said, voice rough. The defendant will remain seated. Gasps whispered through the gallery. The judge left the bench and disappeared through the side door. In his chambers, Carmichael opened a drawer and pulled out a photo, faded and cracked at the edges. A military unit stood in a line of desert uniforms, dust and sun smeared across their faces. He scanned it quickly. There, in the back row, taller than the others, stood Walter Grady. He pulled up a military database. Walter's file blinked onto the screen. 3 tours. Bronze Star. Special Commendation for Heroism in Iraq. And then, 1 mission report in particular. Fallujah, 2003. During a chaotic ambush, Walter had driven a burning supply truck away from his unit, saving 17 men. Among the names of those rescued, Private First Class Michael Carmichael. The judge sat back in his chair, stunned. It was him. The judge returned to the courtroom with a face carved from stone. He did not sit immediately. He did not speak. He stared at Walter Grady the way a man might stare into a mirror that shows the past more clearly than it shows the present. Mr. Grady, he said slowly, remain seated. The room, filled only with routine cases and board officials moments earlier, now felt dense with silence. The prosecutor looked confused. The court reporter paused, her fingers hovering just above the keys. Something had shifted. Not just in the judge, but in the room itself, like the atmosphere before a storm. Judge Carmichael resumed his seat but did not open the file again. I have reviewed the record, he said, voice steadier now but lined with something older than law, something closer to memory. And while the prosecution suggests continued detention based on prior incidents, I find compelling factors that demand this court's attention. Walter remained still, head lowered. He hadn't recognized the judge. Time had carved deep lines across both their faces, and in Walter's world, faces blurred after enough years. But the voice, there was something in the voice that lingered like the echo of a command from decades ago. Judge Carmichael leaned forward. There is no need for a plea today, he continued. This matter is under advisement. Mr. Grady will be released to supervised community care pending further review. The prosecutor opened his mouth to object, but the judge cut him off with a raised hand. This man is not a threat to the community, the judge said. He is the reason much of it exists. The gavel did not fall. The order was not typed. The courtroom simply exhaled, and the case, just another file in a sea of files, was over. Walter stood, uncertain, as an officer gently uncuffed him. Outside, the wind was sharp. A few snowflakes drifted in lazy spirals. Walter pulled his coat tighter around him and prepared to disappear again. But he wasn't allowed to. A black government vehicle pulled to the curb as if summoned by fate itself. A man in dress uniform stepped out, decorations neat, hat squared to the wind. He saluted Walter. Not with ceremony, but with the solemn gravity of one soldier recognizing another. Staff Sergeant Grady, he said quietly, we've been asked to escort you. Walter blinked. Escort me? To the Veterans Transitional Center. They're expecting you. Room, hot meal, full review of your benefits. Judge Carmichael made some calls. The man didn't wait for a reply. He just opened the door. Walter hesitated only a second before stepping in. The interior was warm. Clean. The seats smelled like leather and possibility. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was riding toward nowhere. The center was a 3-story brick building tucked behind a line of faded row houses. Inside, it was alive with quiet purpose, other veterans moving between counseling rooms, job prep classes, medical offices. Walter was led to a room on the 2nd floor. Bed freshly made. Towel folded. A pair of clean socks waiting on the blanket. That night, he ate a meal he didn't have to scavenge. Showered with water that ran hot without complaint. Slept in a bed that didn't creak or shiver under cold. Morning came. And with it, something Walter hadn't expected. A visit. The door opened and a young man stepped in, early 30s, maybe. Civilian clothes, but unmistakable military posture. He introduced himself as Lieutenant Carmichael, the judge's son. "My father told me what you did," he said. "Not just in Iraq. Not just for him. But what you've been doing every day since." Quiet dignity. Holding the line when nobody's watching. He placed something on the desk beside the bed. A small wooden box. Inside, a bronze star freshly minted, an official reissue to replace the one Walter had long since pawned away for winter clothes. Beneath it, a single photograph. The unit in Iraq. Sunburnt and dusty, arms slung over shoulders, youth in their eyes. Walter stood in the back, tall and proud. And tucked in the box lid was a note, handwritten. "Sometimes, we don't get to choose the moment that defines us. But we do get to choose whether we live up to it. You already did. It's our turn now." Walter didn't cry. He hadn't in years. But as he sat there with the box in his lap, something cracked gently in his chest. Like ice beginning to thaw. He stayed at the center for 3 weeks. Received medical care. Reapplied for the benefits he had once abandoned. And when they asked him what he wanted to do next, he didn't hesitate. "I want to work," he said. "Something with my hands. Something honest." 2 months later, Walter began working part-time at a local hardware store owned by a Korean War veteran. The customers called him Mr. Grady. He stocked shelves, advised on tools, and repaired old things others would have thrown away. Every day at noon, he ate lunch at a bench outside the store. Just a sandwich, a bottle of water, and a folded napkin. On the edge of the table, taped down beneath plexiglass, was the note from the judge's son. Others began to notice. A boy who had once seen Walter as a shadow now waved as he passed. The owner of Morelli's quietly dropped off a new coat, without comment. And the police officer who had cuffed him came by with his partner, offering free rides to the VA on cold days. Kindness had taken root where punishment once ruled. And in the center of it all, Walter Grady, the forgotten man, was no longer forgotten. Spring came late that year in Brooklyn. But when it did, the change was unmistakable. Dogwoods bloomed in the corners of concrete lots. Sidewalk cafes pulled out their tables. And on a quiet Saturday morning, beneath a sky the color of washed denim, Walter Grady walked the last mile to his new job without the backpack he had carried for over a decade. It now sat folded on a shelf at the Veterans Center, retired like the uniform it once accompanied. Walter had grown used to his new rhythm. Coffee at 6:30. A newspaper from the corner stand. Work by 8 o'clock. His body still ached, and some nights the dreams returned uninvited, but he faced them with a steadier hand. He was no longer drifting. No longer just surviving. He was seen. That alone changed everything. 3 times a week, he volunteered after work at a local youth shelter. Not because anyone asked him to, but because he recognized the look in their eyes. The look of children who thought the world had forgotten them. He didn't preach. Didn't tell war stories. He taught them how to use tools. How to change a tire. How to patch drywall. How to stay calm when everything felt like it was falling apart. "You're like a grandpa who builds stuff," one girl said shyly. Walter only smiled. He hadn't been called family in years. In June, a letter arrived. Handwritten. Stamped with the seal of the city of New York. The mayor was hosting a community service recognition event at City Hall. Among those to be honored, Walter Grady. He considered throwing the letter away. He didn't want applause. Or cameras. But he remembered what Judge Carmichael had said in that courtroom, not with his words, but with the way he stood, the way the silence had fallen like reverence. Sometimes, letting others witness your redemption helps them believe in their own. So he went. City Hall was packed. Teachers, firefighters, small business owners, and neighborhood volunteers sat in rows of folding chairs. Walter stayed near the back, uncomfortable in the borrowed suit the center had given him. When his name was called, the applause started slowly. But it didn't stop. It grew row by row until the entire room was standing. He walked to the podium slowly, unsure of where to look. The mayor handed him a plaque. The inscription read, "For service beyond the call, to country and to community." Then, unexpectedly, the mayor stepped aside. From the wings, an older man emerged in full military dress. Judge Michael Carmichael. Not in his robe. Not in the stance of authority. But in uniform. He saluted Walter. And Walter, whose hands had not trembled in years, returned the salute with the dignity of a soldier who had never stopped serving. They shook hands. And then, without announcement, the judge reached into his pocket and drew out a small velvet box. Inside, a challenge coin engraved with 2 dates. Fallujah, 2003. Brooklyn, 2023. One for the day Walter saved lives in war. The other for the day he chose not to run. The crowd remained silent, as if noise would fracture the moment. Even those who didn't know the story could feel its weight. As if silence said more than any speech ever could. Walter said nothing into the microphone. He just nodded. A gesture both humble and complete. The next morning, the hardware store was busier than usual. Someone had posted a photo from the ceremony online. Customers lined up not just to buy tools, but to shake his hand. Children pointed. Veterans came in quietly, tapping the counter twice, the silent salute of shared history. Someone had placed a new sign near the register. Ask for Mr. Grady. He fixes more than hardware. Walter removed it that afternoon. Not because he didn't appreciate it, but because kindness should never be advertised. The plaque from the mayor now sat on a shelf behind the counter. Next to it, the folded photo of his old unit. Above them both, the challenge coin mounted in a frame. Visitors always asked about it. But Walter never explained. Instead, he'd hand them a screwdriver or a nail set and show them how to do something for themselves. That was explanation enough. One morning, a young man came into the store, nervous, hands shaking. He was wearing the uniform of a National Guard recruit. He had heard about Walter. "I messed up," the young man said. "I don't know if I can come back from it." Walter placed a hand on his shoulder. Then handed him a hammer. "There's no such thing," he said. Later that night, back in his room at the center, Walter opened a small wooden drawer. Inside was a folded napkin, a yellowed photo, and the original dog tags he thought he'd lost. He held them for a moment. And then, gently, closed the drawer again. What had begun as the theft of a loaf of bread on a freezing afternoon had become a lesson to a city, a courtroom, a judge, and a new generation. Not because Walter asked for anything, but because he gave something when he had almost nothing left. That small act was enough. And it always will be. Kindness without question is enough.